Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to this breakout session on promoting mental health and mitigating self-harm. My name is David Sullivan. I'm the Executive Director at the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, which is a new industry effort to develop best practices that can be assessed for promoting trust and safety on the internet. I am really pleased to be here and be joined by an unparalleled panel of experts from a variety of different organizations working on some of these really difficult and challenging issues as mental health as it relates to the internet and online services has really taken on such a prominent role in recent times. So what we're going to do, we only have an hour and we want to make the best possible use of this time. So we're going to first just do a lightning round of introductions and then get into the conversation. My pronouns, by the way, are he, him. So we're going to start with everyone just introducing themselves, their organizations, and their preferred pronouns. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Turner to go first.
Thank you, David. And thank you to the Family Online Safety Institute for addressing this very important topic. My name is Dr. Shairi Turner. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Chief Medical Officer for Crisis Text Line. I'm an internist and pediatrician by training with a focus on childhood trauma.
Great. And then Dan, we'll go to you next.
Thanks, David. I'm Dan Fichter. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the head of artificial intelligence and engineering at the Trevor Project.
Excellent. Amit.
Hi, guys. Amit, he, him. I lead strategy and partnerships at ActDefense, where we help the world's biggest and smallest tech platforms mitigate the risk of online harms. And happy to be here.
Glad to have you. Victoria.
Great. Thanks, David. My name is Victoria McCullough. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the head of Trust and Safety Outreach and Partnerships for the Americas at TikTok.
So yeah, we're just, I love the fact that we have such a variety of organizations from nonprofits to big platforms that are working together and collaborating in different ways, thinking about how to tackle this topic. I also wanted to say at the outset that, of course, given the subject matter we're dealing with here, we are going to be covering some difficult topics. And while we're going to be focusing on opportunities for positive change, we're also not going to be shying away from some of the really challenging content that we're contending with here. And so I understand if for some people this might not be your breakout session, and we understand that. So with that out of the way, I wanted to first talk to you, turn to you, Dr. Turner, to tell us a little bit more about Crisis Text Line and sort of what you are seeing from the way that your services are being used about where things stand when it comes to particularly sort of the mental health of children and teens and young people.
Yes, very important. So Crisis Text Line is a national free 24/7 crisis intervention and support service that's run solely on a text platform. We now also have web chat. We're powered by our phenomenal volunteers who are supervised by mental health professionals. Crisis Text Line is for anyone, anywhere, at any time. We've actually trained over 40,000 volunteers in crisis de-escalation and support, and we now have a fully bilingual and bicultural service, having recently launched our Spanish service with Latinx clinical supervisors and coaches to support our bilingual volunteers. From a data and tech standpoint, we have patented algorithms that we use to triage the texters who are most at risk for suicide to ensure that they are connected to a volunteer within 8 seconds. We don't just deal in suicide, but we make sure that those people who text in crisis, who are at the greatest risk, gets services as quickly as possible. We have a 100% response rate. Being data and tech driven, after every conversation ends, both the volunteer and the texter can fill out a survey to collect demographics and information about the conversation. This way, Crisis Text Line can adapt our resources in the moment to support what's going on nationally, so to align with national trends. So for our purposes here, From an analysis of our anonymized data from 2020, we had 1.4 million crisis text line conversations in that time, half of which were actually initiated by young people. And we can say, what's relevant to our discussion today, we were finding that young people and young texters are dealing more with grief, eating disorders, stress, anxiety, and our texters are even below the age of 13. So just to give a sense of how young the texters are that text in. Young people were 45% more likely to contact us overnight in 2020. And interestingly, bullying, depression, and suicidal ideation actually dropped significantly from our conversations in 2020 as compared to 2019. But that being said, we had anxious young people who were texting in about COVID, about schoolwork, about being awake, so struggling with sleep. So for us at this time, when young people are heavily relying on social media, mobile apps, mental health support through their phones, it's really important to us. And what we believe is that crisis text line can be an important resource for them to access the support that they need. Again, anywhere, anytime, by texting in 741-741, and they will be received by a volunteer, usually within the first 5 minutes. And we're excited to be here. I'm excited to be here to represent Crisis Text Line, especially as we have partnerships with TikTok and the Trevor Project. So.
Thank you. That's really a wonderful introduction. I think is going to set the scene for some topics we're going to turn back to a little bit later. For now, I want to sort of pivot from the kind of one-to-one relationship between a texter and a responder and turn to Dan from the Trevor Project to tell us a little bit more about, in particular, Trevor Space, this community for young LGBTQ people, and how that works and how that plays a role in this space. So Dan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. So yeah, Trevor Space is an online peer support community for LGBTQ folks under 25 around the world. About half of the users of Trevor Space, we've had about 400,000 young folks use Trevor Space. About half are in the US, half are in other parts of the world. As we're speaking, by the way, I'm so interested in the introductions from folks in the chat, from folks who are attending. So thanks for posting these. The Trevor Project in general does also offer one-to-one crisis counseling. Similarly to Crisis Text Line, we are here 24/7. We have a chat line, a text line, and we have a phone line as well. But again, focused on the LGBTQ youth community, and those one-to-one services for now are in the United States. We started Trevor Space, our peer support community, in recognition that in many parts of the internet are vitally important for young people in exploration of their identity, in making friends, in finding connection, but also in recognition, especially at the time that we first launched Trevor Space, that it can be very difficult, especially for queer young folks, to safely find their people online, and that many forms of social media that aren't able to attend specifically to the needs of the community, and especially to the needs of folks discussing their mental health very frankly and very openly on an online forum, that there are special tools and special approaches that seem to work especially well. We run a survey not only of our Trevor Space users, but a broad survey of LGBTQ youth mental health in the US. And in our most recent survey just earlier this year, we heard that 96% of LGBTQ young folks that we surveyed said social media positively impacts their well-being. We also heard from the same respondents, 88% said that social media sometimes negatively impacts their well-being. And so it's a very complicated picture. The same folks who are finding meaningful connections, meaningful emotional validation, finding resources through social media are in other senses, in other contexts, other times, also finding social media to be stressful. Some of the things that are going on right now on Trevor Space some of the things going on always are young people just very candidly and openly making friends. I was just reading some of the threads from the last couple of days over the weekend on Trevor Space. There are threads like, anyone want to be friends or something? I'm lonely, I want friends, both of those with a ton of responses. Anyone want to be close friends was a particularly popular thread over the weekend. Post a picture of yourself and I'll give you a character from a fandom I'm in that I think might connect with you. We also have threads on Trevor Space where especially trans and gender nonconforming young folks first experiment with using their new pronouns or using a new name. We have a lot of threads where folks ask other users to address them by their name for the first time, and they get to feel what that feels like. And we also have a lot of frank discussion of mental health issues among our users, and our moderators are there to make sure that when folks express particularly acute ideation around harming themselves, we're there to be able to reach out and remind them that we do have one-to-one crisis services. We commissioned an external study of Trevor Space over the summer, and we can get into this a little bit more if it's interesting. But what we learned was what our users are doing sort of falls into a category, the sort of the pillar of safety, of being able to connect with people and share who they are discreetly, in many cases anonymously, on Trevor Space. The ability to meet other people who are like them. For many of our users, it's the first time meeting someone else who's like them. The ability to get trusted resources from people they trust, so to find websites and to find online and offline resources that other young LGBTQ folks have vetted, to explore their identity, to help find answers to some of the biggest questions in their life, to find affirmation. There is so much support, judgment-free, empathy, making folks feel like they matter, a lot of positivity, and reduce pressure. Trevor Space for a lot of our users represents a place where they can make mistakes socially, and where they can feel and they can see that they're not alone in doing what they're doing. So I'll turn it back to you, David, but really grateful to the other panelists, and excited to hear some of the questions as well.
Thanks so much, Dan. That was really terrific to hear. I think, in very sort of palpable and concrete terms, what these kinds of online opportunities mean and sort of present for young people. And I also definitely want to get back around to a couple of the things that you mentioned, both in terms of the role of moderation in these kinds of spaces, and also the power and importance of anonymity. But before we do that, I want to transition a little bit from, I think, some of the ways that different services can support individuals and communities to really promote mental health, to the other piece of this, which is sort of problematic content communities that are out there that may be actively seeking to do harm. And so I want to hear a little bit from Amit, whose company is looking at that and understanding that, to really understand the state of play. So Amit, over to you. What are you guys seeing?
Thanks, David. So yeah, as all online communities go, there's good and bad. And there are some that are good and bad, and nuance is the key thing when looking at them overall. And unlike other abuse types or online harms areas where active defense works, such as terror or misinformation or hate speech, which are clearly shouldn't have a place and should be moderated and regarded, there are certain communities, specifically in the self-harm and eating disorder communities, which it's more intricate and complicated to discern if something is malicious or if something is really providing a good place for people to interact and support for each other. So our latest research that Active Defense has done, and we do several of these each and every year, and I'm happy to share with everyone listening in if you're interested, was about eating disorder communities online specifically. And what we found out are a couple of interesting things. One is most by large communities for eating disorders are positive, and they're there for eating disorder people suffering from it, and they support each other. But there are a couple of exclamation points that could raise awareness for parents as well as the platforms that we have in attendance today. First of all, there's a set of keywords that most people are already aware of these days pertaining to eating disorders. And specifically, if you see an account or a community that says DNI, if not ED, which translates into do not interact, if not eating disorder, somebody's trying to hide something. And usually that's a cause for concern. And you should double click on that and see what you find there. As well as there's a couple of support activities that are on the verge or might be a prone to go the negative route. Such support activities are inspiration. So terms like thinspo, like thin inspiration, are things that are taking things too far and not supportive of the problem that maybe people want to have a community around, and is actually promoting eating disorders, as well as certain challenges that the majority of them you are all aware of, the different platforms that have great, fun, happy challenges. Some of them might be a little less sincere. Each person with his take will take it where it is, but if your child is engaging in some of the challenges, maybe check out what's the content of it at the end of the day. And the last thing for the platforms out there is really to be more proactive with these type of communities and engagements on your platform. They're all doing a great job of offering text lines and phone calls or sending to relevant places online that gets more information for support, but there's still room for more proactiveness to stop a certain community from crossing that threshold from being supportive to actually hurting someone at the end of the day. And we'll discuss in depth more how that proactive looks in reality.
Thank you, Amit. So speaking of platforms, let's go next to Victoria to hear how TikTok, sort of on the whole, is looking at and addressing all of these challenging issues. Great.
Thank you, David. I work at, for anyone who's not familiar with TikTok, we are an entertainment platform. We're about 1 billion people strong today. And our team specifically on the trust and safety side is here to maintain the joy and creativity mission of TikTok. So a lot of what I think we've heard this from other panelists today, a lot of the mental health well-being and support that we see on TikTok is really from our community themselves. And so we're seeing lots of conversation. I loved what Dan mentioned earlier, lots of conversations that remind me of just identity formation that is happening on these platforms. And I think and often a lot of cases we're seeing our community really support each other and lift up some of these discussions. And on the specifically for the outreach and partnership side, it's our critical partnerships with Crisis Text Line, Trevor Project, and FOSI that really help us ensure that we're delivering the best resources, that we're understanding some of the activity that is happening within our community and some of those trends, and how on the trust and safety side, we can continue to really build thoughtful policies. We can build features with some of these insights that Dr. Turner mentioned. And so in many cases, we're working with what we can do on platform, but also ultimately how we deliver resources depending on where our community is in their well-being journey. So I think we've kind of seen run the gamut. I think with what Dan mentioned, in some cases, I think you often have community members on TikTok who are just looking for support and some connection. And then in other cases, we might have community and people on the platform who are in more in need of crisis resources like what Crisis Text Line has to offer. And so with our team at TikTok, we're really focused on meeting people, meeting our community where they are, and staying ahead of some of these trends, and that we're always evolving. I mean, I think one of the biggest things, and I feel like Amit sort of mentioned this as well, is sort of never mission accomplished. I think with a lot of this work, and we're so grateful, I think, for some of our partners who allow us to take to better understand what they're seeing as professionals, what they're seeing with their platforms, and hopefully really embed that into the TikTok community and really evolving those resources, evolving our approach to hopefully safeguarding and again, really preserving that joy and creativity on the platform.
Thank you, Victoria. That's really, I think, helps like tie together everything that we've already heard. You know, speaking of kind of, you know, I think one of the themes that's arisen several times, both in terms of people's comments and in some of the data that's been shared, you know, about the complexity and the need for nuance here, and how you know, social media in its different forms and permutations can be both critical, but also, you know, can be very challenging for people as in terms of mental health. I'm curious to hear from all of you, or any of you, about sort of how social platforms, you know, are kind of dealing with these issues in the context of the pandemic, as it continues to be such a major feature of our life, driving different behavior online. So, you know, especially when it comes to things like self-harm, eating disorders, a topic that's already been raised, you know, and this need to both help people find support, while also keeping an eye on those communities that might be causing harm. You know, how do we see the COVID pandemic affecting this behavior? And I'll throw it open to anybody who wants to jump in.
I can start just with some of the data that we found, just speaking specifically to eating disorders. So we're finding that we have that there was additional an increase in eating disorder mention during the pandemic, and you know, it's just, as with all technology, right? There's extreme positives and extreme negatives. The positives for kids, especially where the pandemic has taken up percentage-wise such a large percentage of their lifetime as a teenager. For us as adults, you know, 1 to 2 years is significant, but for them, where they're, you know, a third of their or quarter of their adolescence has been altered, the positives are that they can still connect, right? That they're still able to make connections to each other in not necessarily direct interpersonal ways, but in somehow meaningful ways. The other positives obviously have been the development of so much access to telemental health, to apps, to the organizations like we have here. Where that wasn't available, where people weren't forced to sort of think more creatively about how do we get access for mental health services to people. On the negative side, obviously, kids spending a lot of time looking, you know, a lot of screen time, looking at different apps, the self-comparison, the, you know, ability to put your best features forward always sort of creates an altered reality that, you know, as adults, we have more perspective, but for kids, there's just so much focus on how people look and what people are doing and how happy everybody is, which I think gives a skewed view of what people's situations are. And then lastly, just the need to monitor and curate the intake, right? So the constant streams, if it's negative, that kids can see and revisit, you know, without, if parents aren't monitoring that, it's just codifying itself in young developing brains. You know, images that we saw summer of 2020 can just be traumatizing and re-traumatizing for young brains. So it has positive, it's shown us extreme positivity and forcing forward of technology in a way that supports people, but it also has, you know, the downside that we have to continue to grapple with.
Yeah, to bounce off of those ideas, as in every industry and every aspect of our life, COVID was an accelerant and an amplification of everything that happened beforehand. So I think there's a switch in people under the age of 15, let's say, where they perceive the world probably more than 50% through technology than in real life, as we are still battling this pandemic. And it's a shift we have to think through, both on the people who are working on these platforms and the government and us as parents and us as peers to one another, as well as the amplification of everything that we're doing. Everything that's positive with the technology that we're getting now is very, very positive, as Dr. Turner mentioned. The telemedicine revolution is well upon us, but we also have to be aware of the amplification of the negative sides of the technology. And you know, FOSI's been doing a great job for a lot of time, a lot of years, and is crucial, I think, at this moment as well, to continue the discussion and discovery of how can we take back control, and really synthesize the good and the amplification of good and minimize the amplification of the bad, basically, of technology.
Just want to check whether Dan or Victoria, do you want to add anything there?
With COVID over the course of the pandemic, we, of course, observed a sharp drop in young folks reaching out to our crisis counselors about in-person bullying, when so many students went to all remote or partial remote learning. But very sadly, an increase in those times in young folks reaching out about suicidal feelings, or in crisis in general, because of being stuck at home, oftentimes with unsupportive families, as well as being cut off from their support networks, which included not just friends, but included supportive teachers, trusted adults outside the home. So of course, as with everything we've been discussing, it's been a very complicated picture. I think I would only validate from Trevor's experience what Dr. Turner shared about the rise in reports. I think around eating disorders, I think especially as folks of any age feel a loss of control and a loss of agency, eating disorders, often occur when folks are, and especially young folks, are not feeling the sort of autonomy that they may have been expecting and that they may have had just before the pandemic.
And David, I would love to add a couple of things that I think we're seeing. One, I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the things I've seen at my time working in platforms, I was at Tumblr prior to TikTok, but I grew up in a really small town in rural America where in often cases we were very physically isolated from resources. And I grew up at a time when a lot of the resources we have today weren't available. And so when I did move in to working with a lot of these platforms, it was remarkable to see the resources and the connection that we were able to make in these online communities that were really able to sprout up out of supporting each other when physically isolated, or when maybe not having like resources in town that could help support and then ultimately really make people feel less alone. And I think we've certainly seen that across the pandemic. As everyone mentioned, I think we've seen a real heightened conversation around, and with more of our creators supporting each other, creating content that really lends itself to positivity and helping recognize no bones Bones or no bones is the one that kind of comes to mind as something that is sort of risen out of the moment. But then in addition, I think we're also really trying on our side to recognize some of the things that have been discussed so far, which is building really tools that help create the safest, healthiest experience, including screen time management tools in our family pairing. So we're trying to meet the moment that really hopefully helps our community really develop a healthy experience. So I think our tools and features on TikTok are something where we're continuing to try to evolve and recognize and again better understand where our communities might be coming from and the challenges that they might be facing, and then hopefully create and empower them and give them control over that experience.
I think David might be frozen. So that being said, let's continue. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the challenges. So crisis text line's here to support, but what are you all seeing as far as kind of combating harmful content in this space, right? What are some, well, let's offer some opportunities for parents. What should parents do to help support? So from our perspective, Crisis Text Line provides support, Trevor Projects provides support. What are tools and tips we can give to parents to support their family unit, right? During these times where we know kids are on the platform, or I'm sorry, on social media, on apps consistently. What would we say to support parents?
I mentioned this just a second ago, but I can expand a little bit here because FOSI and National Parent Teacher Association have been two of our biggest partners at TikTok at helping us develop resources and guides. And ultimately, one of my biggest takeaways from, I think, those partnerships is really encouraging parents to have that conversation. In so many cases, I think what we heard from our partners who were talking to teenagers and to people who were using social media, young people who were using social media, that they were actually wanting parents to really engage them in that conversation. They wanted to help understand how to, again, develop and create a healthy experience and relationship with social media. So for us, I think our parents guide and that we have done with FOSI, as well as our National Parent Teacher Association, really try to dive into tips that parents can leverage when engaging in that biggest discussion. But I think our biggest takeaway from that was just to encourage parents to really, to not be afraid of that in so many cases, teenagers really want that discussion and are ready to embrace it if asked.
David, we were just in your absence. We had started talking about what support we could provide from our different lenses and organizations for parents. So Victoria had started. I would just add, for Crisis Text Line, we have a really nice school toolkit that supports both teachers, administrators, parents, and teens. That's accessible on our website, crisistextline.org, because it's about knowing what's there and figuring out how to implement it. But
well, thank you. Thank you for continuing the conversation in my absence. I am now on a hotspot connection from my phone because my internet just gave out. I apologize for the connectivity problems. Thank you for starting to share those resources. Thank you for starting to put some of those resources in the chat. I would really encourage our speakers as well as our participants to do the same. So perhaps right now we can also think maybe unless Dan or Amit or if anybody else wanted to come in on that point about resources for parents, maybe just check and see if there's anything else folks want to add there.
Well, not to toot this organization's own horn, but FOSI has a great parenting guide and parenting toolkit, which is probably 101 to anything a parent wants to know about his children in online media and how to navigate those things. And I would definitely start there and recommend it.
Great. So then maybe let's think about, what do we see as the role of government in this space? Obviously, there's no shortage of proposals out there for new legislation and regulations relating to online safety, online harms, and of course, mental health, I think, is taking center stage in a lot of these discussions. So let me throw it back out to the panel to see if there are views in terms of particular forms of regulation that might be helpful, particular approaches that might be counterproductive.
I can start off. So generally, to the general question, yes, government has a say, and it should be a pretty strong say as to how to regulate or legislate certain safeguards specifically for children online, and specifically in the roles of self-harm and mental health. And we've done this before. There used to be a lot of cigarettes on plenty of screens in the world, and then cigarettes, we found out, are not good for you, and we diminished those. And it's a matter of time until we do that with other subjects and other harms as well. I do think that part of the discussion has to be much more nuanced, as we've said a couple of times, between government, civil society, academia, the industry itself, and to start looking at what can be done or what language could be used in these policies, instead of what we're kind of swimming in, but hopefully the tide is now changing of I point at you, you point at me, regulate me, tell me how, I don't know how, and this back and forth. Eventually, some grown-ups, which is us now in the room, have to come and say, okay, let's decide on something that we know would be good rather than bad, and nothing's going to be perfect, but we have to start putting things in place. And I do believe that this year and the certain criteria of what we're dealing with right now is an opportunity for real change on the regulatory side.
In the world where the Trevor Project operates, one of the most significant risks that a lot of young LGBTQ folks face is from conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is a discredited, disproven, and for most folks a traumatic and very harmful thing to live through, which takes the form both of one-on-one counseling, group counseling, and also all sorts of programs, including all sorts of overnight programs. So conversion therapy is not yet outlawed in many parts of the US. So I would definitely put on an agenda for promoting mental health and mitigating mental health risks for young folks online. A government role, not only in closing down conversion therapy practices legislatively, but also looking at, under existing law, looking at the ways that conversion therapy is promoted online, the way that folks find conversion therapists online, and potentially seeing that through a lens of deceptive marketing practices, which is already federally prohibited, and which is an angle that I think potentially regulators could come together at, even in the absence of further action by states and cities.
I would add, not everyone is aware there's 988 legislation through the federal government, which has been passed, which in July of 2022 enacts such that instead of calling 911, which oftentimes we know people in crisis get diverted to law enforcement, there is now this legislation and appropriation so that people can text, chat, or call 988 and be diverted to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, who we are working, and the Trevor Project is working in partnership with, to support text, but the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, Crisis Text Line in support, Trevor Project in support is huge, right? So that's a huge piece of legislation that Congress and the White House have both supported and funded, so that people in mental health crisis are not attended to, for lack of a better word, by law enforcement. And that is huge. That is a huge initiative by the government that will change the face of mental health, where we're providing mobile crisis units. There's funding for mobile crisis units. There's state support. All of these things are such a positive move on the part of the government to recognize that law enforcement has a role, and they're not always trained to work with people who are in mental health crisis, and that people deserve the opportunity to be able to text to a crisis text line, to a Trevor Project when they're in crisis, and receive that de-escalation without necessarily having to call 911, which can bring law enforcement.
Dr. Turner, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because something that these specifically the 998 example, and then how government has really inspired in what I hope is eventually this large village-like movement, because that's what it feels like I've seen in my time working in government, and then working now at TikTok, is that's the only way we really are able to move things forward. And I do think government has an opportunity to really build those coalitions, lift up some of the challenges, hopefully drive resources. But what I've seen, and I think our panel is probably a great example of this, but it feels like it really takes each of our organizations, business, government, to really be able to shift the conversation, and hopefully, as you noted, shift resources to where they're needed most. And that's something that hopefully feels hopeful in the grand scheme of things, given some of the challenges ahead. But I feel like that's such a you're reminding me of how powerful this moment is with this specific resource.
So I hope folks can hear me. My connection seems a little wobbly, but just wanted to say, so first, I think those are terrific examples that also illustrate, how given the kinds of risks we're talking about, span many different platforms, span online life and offline life, and we need to have responses that are similarly sort of nimble and collaborative. And so I wanted to ask sort of, both how can companies in this space, and it's a somewhat self-serving question because I have a few ideas about it myself, but how can companies work together to try to tackle some of these issues as they manifest across many different platforms? And how can companies also perhaps collectively be working with governments here?
Do you want to kick us off with some ideas, or I can whatever you want?
Well, I'll just say, so at the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, which is a group of 11 current company members, we're trying to elevate the discipline of trust and safety as a whole. And so rather than looking at specific kinds of harms, we're trying to see how can companies embrace best practices that can be used to sort of ensure a safer and more trustworthy and rights-respecting services, regardless of the particular type of risk. So we're trying to beef that up. We're providing a forum where company practitioners can work together to identify best practices from more of an empirical point of view, to say, here's what is actually happening in companies to address these issues. We know that's only one part of the solution, but by sort of identifying that and providing a way of documenting and improving company practices, that's one way we can contribute. So we're not looking specifically at, say, mental health, but we're looking at all of these types of risks and figuring out how we can, as an industry, try to identify and evolve and mature best practices. So that's our piece of the puzzle. But I'd be curious to hear from others what else might work here.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting initiatives already going on, and it's definitely brought up to the table a lot more in the past year or so. We've been seeing all over the world, really, in all different types of organizations, try to find a mechanism in which data sets could be shared securely, and then either trained on or notified through different mechanisms. And we have example of this in other abuse areas as well. The sexual abuse area, there's a data hashing component. In the terror space, there's 2 data hashing data sets that are evolving. And I think definitely something could be done in self-harm specifically and mental health in general. And I think at the end of the day, it's an understanding that this problem of mental health is not only online or offline. And online, it's not a specific problem to one platform. It exists on all the big ones. It exists on the very small fringe ones. It exists on a one-to-one messenger capability. And until we understand that we need all the types of interfaces of humans and technology to deal with like the mental health, basically pandemic as it is at itself, then we won't get very far. And I think we're starting to see those boundaries and border come down, but there's still a lot more to do. And helpful to have data sets to train technology for, so we could alert in time.
For us at Crisis Text Line, we have quite a few partnerships where we support TikTok, YouTube, Netflix, insofar as helping to mitigate and bridge that gap between content and support, right? So if there's triggering content online, a Netflix would not necessarily have the support in place, but after programming like that, they know to put in crisis, for support, text crisis text line 741-741. That allows that balance between, the freedom of content without the absence of responsibility. So the responsibility then is to provide the resources which Crisis Text Line can then offer to our many, corporate and other partners. I mean, we have, and then on the data side, we have partnerships with states where they use a specific keyword, which allows them to gather state-specific data on what's trending. As we look at allocation of resources, what's trending across states or a given state, and that state can collect data using its keyword, so they can appropriate in a way that recognizes what the population in the state is in need of. So if it's about, the conversations are coming up about bullying or financial resources or whatever the conversations are, that allows states to be empowered to direct their funds towards the issues that are putting, constituents and individuals into crisis.
I would add to a couple of other trends we're seeing. I've seen a lot of other business, entertainment brands, brands like Dove. Dove has done some really incredible work around body positivity. I think we're seeing more and more beyond even platforms and tech and even some of the advocacy organizations. I think you're seeing a lot of brands pick up and really and they're doing it not in a vacuum. They're often leaning on the resources that whether it's Crisis Text Line or Trevor Project, they're going to all of the right advocacy groups and expert voices to develop those. I think TikTok has really tried to the best of our abilities, really amplify a lot of that work with our community so that they're able to get those resources, and it comes from sort of a different voice that hopefully is a trusted one, can be an accessible one. And then even I want to mention Dr. Turner and the Crisis Text Line team. We had a really amazing partnership with them for World Mental Health Day. So I think in some cases it's sort of seizing, while I know there's often like a lot of noise around those big commemorative moments, I've seen in the last several years just a huge momentum across platforms and many advocacy organizations using those moments to enhance those conversations, bring out those resources, hopefully create a more welcoming space for everyone, again, wherever they are on their well-being journey. But I think it's been partnerships like those where we've been able to amplify with other brands and other advocacy groups that have been really, we've seen some just really powerful moments and connections being made.
Thanks, Victoria. I think that's like a really important reminder that that when we think about companies and the role of industry in this space, we're not just talking about social media platforms, but there's all kinds of players from the private sector who should be and are being part of conversations and solutions. So we have about 10 minutes left, so I did want to turn to Q&A from the audience. Please do continue to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I wanted to start with a question from Rodrigo, who is wondering how to strengthen youth peer education beyond the sort of social support that peers are already giving one each another sometime. He says more curated evidence base is an important baseline, but was curious whether our panelists had other ideas they wanted to suggest there.
I would actually be really interested if there are folks who have thoughts on this and want to add them to the chat. I wish that this is something I knew more about. I know of the teen mental health first aid certification that I think Lady Gaga has been a champion of, and I know that some schools have adopted. In general, though, I wish that there were more, and I certainly wish that I were aware of more concrete, real, definite mental health related trainings for young folks who want to be great supporters to one another. I don't see why there isn't, like a physical ed elective, for high school juniors or seniors where they can maybe skip out on softball and learn about mental health, learn about how to be supportive to one another, to folks in their lives now and in the future. I think it's an area that would not only be really useful in the moment, but also in trying to create more pathways into mental health work for young folks. I think we talk to a lot of young folks about vocational opportunities. We talk about some opportunities in health, pre-college or without college. There are really not a lot of opportunities for young folks to get into mental health directly after graduating high school. And I wish that were different. If folks have thoughts on that on the panel or on the chat, I'd love to hear.
I think so. From our perspective at Crisis Text Line, we advocate and would continue to advocate for suicide prevention and mental health awareness to be taught in the middle schools and the high schools, because we know and we've seen with sexual education that's the time, right? So we know just from data that you're not going to suggest suicide by teaching about it, right? So teaching suicide prevention, empowering kids, yes, in the middle school, about what to look for, how to reach out, what are resources. I mean, we are seeing an uptick in suicide amongst younger children. So we have to address that in a way that's formalized, right? Like we bring it to the curriculum and we have people teach about it so that kids know, number one, to recognize it for themselves, but number two, how do you support a peer? That's a frightening thing, to see a peer deteriorate or have a mental health crisis and not have any idea what to do, right? That is of the utmost importance. If we're teaching about health, we have to teach about mental health. We have to teach about suicide prevention.
So another question we had is from Nancy Willard, who asks, can joint efforts, especially with advertisers, be more effectively engaged to address concerns around self-comparison? So any responses to that from our panel?
Yes, for sure. I was at an event last week for brand safety, and brands are increasingly more open to critique of where their ads are showing next to what content and what type of content they're promoting at the end of the day. The flavor of the week is actually misinformation, but it doesn't negate or diminish the discussion about positive bodies and making sure that you're not promoting on a website that is continuing that cycle you know, referencing what you see online as the optimum and having your own voice and being okay with your body. So I think that discussion is already happening. I don't think it's where it needs to be, but in terms of the brand institutes of the World Advertisers Organization, and a group called GARM, Global Advertising, I'll find the word in a second and put it in the chat, then those discussions are already happening, and but we need more help on that front as well.
Yeah, that's the Global Alliance for Responsible Media.
Thank you,
which is another initiative with whom we are engaging, who are working really on that issue of when content is monetized, as opposed to sort of broader trust and safety and content moderation issues that my organization is working on. Any other thoughts on that particular question about how to tackle the sort of self-comparison challenges and partnerships there?
I would just add on to what Amit said, and I'm glad you, David, chimed in with. I was thinking about GARM as a great example of this, but TikTok engages quite a bit with some of those brand safety coalitions that I think are really trying to really push this conversation in the right way. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think advertisers are another really key component where we've seen some really hopeful trends and much more engagement and more of a conversation. I know it's certainly something that TikTok is hopefully continuing to improve our own approach there.
So I think there's a question specific for Dr. Turner. Do you have recommendations for suicide prevention programs for middle and high school students?
That's a great question, and I've been trying to sort through our website to find the school toolkit, because I think a lot of what would be helpful there for schools and school administrators exists there, and I will find it before we're done. I think really bringing to the school the opportunity. Well, FOSI, right? FOSI has resources here. I don't have one that I would particularly recommend. I think it's really about finding a curriculum that your school can dig into and implement and is manageable. So it's going to be important. I'll find the school toolkit link, and that I think will be a helpful place to start.
And thanks to everybody who is contributing links to resources in the chat. So we're only a couple minutes out. So I just want to maybe just check and see if each of our panelists wanted to share any sort of concluding thoughts here before this session comes to a close. And maybe we'll go in reverse order from the way we started at the beginning of the conversation. So I'll go first to you, Victoria.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for the conversation. I've already picked up some really great resources for the trust and safety outreach team at TikTok to use. The only thing I would add on or just reinforce, as has been mentioned earlier, I think there is an incredible movement, I think, that is happening between advocacy groups, as we just discussed, advertisers, government. There is I think, a huge momentum that we're having, and at TikTok, I think we're really hoping to harness the insights that our partners have so that we can continue to evolve our approach. I think the biggest thing I can recommend is that TikTok has some amazing communities around mental health and providing support. We also, again, have some great resources, a couple that I included here today that I would encourage both those who are either in the classroom or parents to check out TikTok's Parents Guide. And we're, again, as I said earlier, there's no the mission is never done. So we really seek, especially the FOSI community's feedback on how we can continue to really evolve that. So just welcome a continued discussion and improvement on those resources, and look forward to continuing that conversation. Thank you.
Amit.
Really engaging conversations, covered a lot of ground. Any of the folks that are watching or in the chat that are on platform people who want access to the research that ActiveFence did about eating disorder and community specifically, feel free to reach out. Anyone that's of interest, more than happy to collaborate. And this was great.
Thank you so much. I'm going to reach out about that. So Dan.
Yeah, this was really great. So engaging. Thank you to everyone who participated. I just encourage folks, if you'd like to reach out to me directly, please do. The Trevor Project is right now especially interested in ways that we can help fill out everything that's in between what we offer today in peer support and what we offer in one-on-one crisis counseling. A lot of young folks come to our website looking for something that is not quite one and not quite the other, looking for resources, looking for self-education, looking to help others, not themselves. We are actively thinking about what are all the sorts of programming tools, resource guides that might fit in that space. I know I'm getting the sense a lot of folks who are listening and participating in chat may have some wonderful ideas. I'd love to connect. Thanks again for being here today.
Yeah. And Dr. Turner.
Yes, thank you for just an excellent conversation. And thank you to all my fellow panelists. It's just been really very invigorating and insightful for myself as well. I would just say everyone plug 741-741 into your phone, both for yourself and for anyone else that might be in crisis nearby, near you, who may need some support. We're also always actively seeking empathetic individuals to be volunteers. So our call to action around volunteerism, we have an online training. So anything can be done from the comfort of your own home, both as a volunteer and as someone in crisis. You can be anywhere from the board, as we say, the boardroom to the classroom, to your closet. You know, it is that extreme at times. So, you know, we have to look out for each other. We have to support each other, and Crisis Text Line is there.
I can't think of better words to close all this out. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to FOSI for this opportunity. Thanks to all our panelists for a conversation that spanned, you know, sort of the from the most sort of practical kind of immediate kind of resources and challenges to sort of big picture ideas about how to take these issues forward and to really ensure that internet and digital services are promoting mental health. So thank you, everybody. With that, I would be remiss if I did not direct folks to the networking and expo opportunities on the left-hand side of the hop-in screen. Thank you for bearing with my internet connection going in and out. I'm glad I was able to participate in the conversation. I'm David Sullivan from the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership. Really appreciated this opportunity. Thank you, everyone.